Beyond Red and Blue, EV Policy in 2023. My name is Catherine Stankin, and I'm the VP of Policy with the Electrification Coalition, and I'll be your host for today. We're excited to be here. This is going to be a great discussion between the Electrification Coalition and the Zero Emission Transportation Association, also known as ZETA. We'll be doing first a brief run through of all the policy wins and market progress made in 2022, and then pivot to look forward to 2023 now that the midterm elections are over. So just a few tech reminders. Yes, this will be recorded. And yes, please put your questions in the chat and our moderators will try to address them as we go through the rest of the panel. So without further ado, we're going to first set the stage with how the market grew in 2022. So I will turn it to Tom Taylor. Tom is a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy, and his focus is on the EV market and on ensuring that states and local governments and climate advocates have great information about the unprecedented federal funding that's coming out of Washington, D.C. So Tom, I'll take it away for your market update.
Cool. Thank you, Catherine. It's really exciting to be here. Thank you for having me. I only have a couple of minutes and I have a lot of slides, but I once had a colleague who was able to get through 100 slides in 5 minutes. So really anything is possible if you believe. So let's go. As Catherine mentioned, I am an analyst at Atlas Public Policy, and our work, in short, is to bring data into public policy conversations. My focus in particular is around transportation, but we also do work on buildings, climate, and disinformation. The data that I will walk through today principally comes from Atlas EV Hub, one of our products, and EV Hub pulls together data from a range of sources to serve as a one-stop shop on EV policy and data. And it's worth noting that EV Hub is free for public agencies or public officials and clean cities coordinators. So, what I'm going to do in my couple of minutes today, first of all, is to do a very quick flyover about where funding is coming from. And then I want to tell three stories, three interesting stories, I think, around where the EV market is at. So I'll start with the flyover. And the point of this is less the numbers themselves, but more to say that there is really significant funding coming in from a range of different sources. So whether we're talking about public funding, utilities, the Volkswagen settlement funding, industry funding, or the two big acts that were just passed, there is really considerable funding that is flowing through to support EVs, whether you're talking about, upstream production, or whether you're talking about, the driving experience and the charging experience. So the whole way through, and the funding we're seeing is really unprecedented. So the first of the three interesting stories that I want to talk through is starts with the fact that the EV market is sort of booming. We saw in Q3, so the latest quarter that we have data for, more than 7% of all new light-duty vehicle sales were electric vehicles. That is really significant, particularly when you look at the left-hand side of this graph. So we're on the right-hand side now, but if you look at the left-hand side of the graph from the end of 2020, that number, which is the black line, was around 3.5%. So we've effectively doubled market share over that time. That's a really considerable growth in the EV market. When you look at this graph as well, you'll also notice the thick red line that goes through, and that is Tesla. Tesla continues to dominate the EV market, and is a really important player. So Tesla captured 51% of all EV sales in Q3 of 2022. When you break the data down further, you can see other interesting trends. So one, I think that is really fascinating is that through mid-2018, we saw battery electric vehicles, so vehicles that run just on batteries, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, so vehicles that run part on battery, part from gasoline. We saw them pretty closely linked in terms of EV sales. But when you look at this graph now and the green line for cumulative EV sales, you can see that there was a really significant change in mid-2018 as Tesla rolled out new models. And since then, we've seen just massive growth in terms of that battery electric vehicle line, such that while plug-in hybrids constitute about 1/3 of all EV sales, in the first half of 2022, they were just 22% of EV sales. So that number appears to be trending downwards for plug-in hybrids. The next interesting story is around automaker announcements. And so I won't spend too long here, but the takeaway from this slide is that automakers have committed enormous funds to manufacture EVs, including significant funds that have been pledged for the United States. But what does that look like on the ground when automakers announce facilities? So over the past couple of months, this again is for Q3, you can see these really enormous announcements across the country. So Nevada to North Carolina to Michigan, from automakers and battery makers to support the EV transition and in doing so, create really significant job centers in different parts of the country. Likewise, when you look at the battery and manufacturing investments over time, the number or the graph is continues to rise really rapidly. And so you can see in 2022, we've seen, unprecedented investments announced from automakers for EV manufacturing and battery manufacturing. One last note on this is that the clustering of jobs is really interesting. So where are we seeing these jobs announced? You can see, one cluster that people talk about often is the Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Southeast cluster. And so it's really interesting to see how that will shape the politics and the landscape of and the job market in that region. But there's also another important cluster that I see, which is the California, Arizona, Nevada cluster. And so it'll be very interesting to see how these clusters continue to grow over time. The last story that I'll tell very briefly, and I imagine the rest of the panelists will get into each of these stories in much greater detail. But the federal funding that we've seen from both the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act is really a game changer. When you look at the NEVI funding, so that's funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to support EV charging, compared with existing funding for EV charging from governments, you can see that's the green bar is the NEVI funding. It's really a massive step change. It's will really significantly change the shape and the way that EV charging works in the United States. And so it's really exciting to see exactly what that looks like. And last but not least, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in August will have really significant market shaping consequences. I'm sure we will go into this more today, but there's important changes around the tax credit, and then there's also huge funding, whether that is to electrify the United States Postal Service fleet or whether that's for clean heavy-duty vehicles. So I might leave it there, but those are three stories that we have been following closely.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, that's a fantastic background and establishes the foundation for our panelists to build onto. And I know we will get into those details. So I'd like to introduce now our first, the moderator for our federal panel. And I'm pleased to introduce Mitch Bainwall, who is the Senior Advisor of the Brunswick Group and the former CEO with the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. And no one knows that sector better than Mitch. So Mitch, take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, and hi all. And I thought I'd start by building off of Tom's comments and make a few quick remarks before turning to the panel. So here we go. So point one, no one contests the destiny of electrification. The only real question is the length of the journey ahead. Point two, as recently as 2020, some, though not all auto companies, were dubious about the EV transition, but the combination of three things just changed that. One is policy, both here and around the world, pulling the market. Two is the market valuation realities that Tesla so dramatically exemplifies. And three is fear of being left behind as the new market emerges. That's changed the landscape in a big way. The dubiousness of autos is gone. It's been replaced by healthy trepidation. Bets are being placed as Tom noted. Point three, the market is moving. Customer interest is soaring. Investment, as he indicated, is massive, but there is a lag in political consensus for a range of reasons. And I'm optimistic that this lag will solve itself ultimately for three reasons. First, the economic investment in red states and purple states is enormous and has governors actively competing for this business, regardless of ideology and party. With that comes enthusiasm from federal office holders representing those plans. Second, for obvious geopolitical reasons, both parties share a commitment both to updating our industrial base and fixing the supply chain breakdowns that were highlighted by COVID and the chip shortage. And third, thoughtful Republicans understand that to be competitive with under 40 voters in future elections, there's got to be an affirmative climate agenda. That point was made abundantly clear in the 11-8 when young voters enabled the Democrats to defy expectations. In short, there's an emerging, albeit slowly, alignment of goals that once were thought to be in conflict, and that's climate and security. So with that, I want to welcome our panel. It's a trio of highly effective advocacy leaders. We have Ben Prohaska, Executive Director of the Electrification Coalition, 10 years with the organization. We have Joe Britton, the Executive Director of the Zero Emission Transportation Association and a longtime Hill veteran. And Leilani Gonzalez, also from ZETA. She's the Policy Director. And like me, she's someone with a strong connection to Sunshine State. So Ben, you're on tap first. Let me ask you this. We've seen some major policy wins for the EV transition that Tom referenced. For this audience, can you summarize these wins and share how they match up with the EC's federal priorities?
Sure, and thank you all so much, and thanks for the great, framing by Tom. So I would start by saying, the EC has been spending the last, more than a decade working on how do you advance transportation electrification in the U.S. And our positioning is always focused around the idea that we are doing this because of the great amount of blood and treasure that we spend every single day to protect the flow of oil. Right now, we basically use almost 20 million barrels of oil on a daily basis. And so, just in the time of this webinar, we're seeing that trickle run out very quickly, and it has a huge impact. It affects our economy. It has direct impacts on our national security. We put our young men and women in harm's way every day to protect the flow of oil. And so transportation electrification really represents the best scalable alternative. We can plug into a domestic grid. We can put ourselves in a position where we can build the future of transportation and drive it. And I think we're starting to see that. And you did a great job, Mitch, of laying out those pieces. On the victory side, we've been working on these issues for a long time, and we've really seen some huge opportunities. I think about when I started in 2013. And the idea that the Leaf and the Volt were really, and the Tesla were really the vehicles available, and the incentive policies and the regulatory policies were very, very nascent. But because of the Inflation Reduction Act, because of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the amount of state action and city action that we're seeing across the country, the U.S. is really moving so quickly. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with all of the policy victories. Yet we still have work to do. But the Inflation Reduction Act is going to put a great amount of investments that allow establish a domestic supply chain and ensure that we're actually developing a supply chain that can meet the ambition and the goals that we've set in the US. And that's really important. So when consumers go out and buy vehicles, they can buy vehicles that are going to have a supply chain that we know is secure and works with our allies. But it doesn't just affect consumer vehicles. It's the full sort of nodes and modes of transportation. And so there are incredible investments being made to ensure we electrify 400,000 school buses across the country, so that we're reducing the impact to communities every day. And my kid, a 5-year-old and 11-year-old, that get on the bus every day and get off every day, as I meet them, I see those diesel fumes coming out of the back of the bus, and I'm excited for the day that they actually show up in an electric bus. We see it in the form of I'm actually at the airport today, and we see it in the form of transit buses, where I'm at RDU in Raleigh, and an electric bus is the bus you take from the where you park your car. And so it shows the example, but there's hundreds of thousands of buses across the country that now we have incredible investments to support. And then also medium duty and heavy duty vehicles. I'm actually on the way to go see the launch of the Semi by Tesla. And just a couple days ago, they proved load-bearing travel and made a 500-mile journey in a Semi. But the investments under and the opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act actually create important incentives to help reduce those early stage upfront costs, so we can really start to move the market faster. And then I'll just mention 2 other quick things. We have the great opportunity to see federal leadership, and we've seen it through the administration. And so we're seeing it with efforts both in executive orders, but also in the idea of investments to transition the federal fleet, one of the largest global fleets in the country. And so we are walking the walk and talking the talk. And then lastly, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I mentioned it earlier, but it's also going to establish the path to be able to build out the infrastructure needed to meet this rapid transition that's taking place. So through creating a national charging network, and creating investments where now every state has resources available to build out a national charging network. Not only that, they've developed really comprehensive plans to develop that infrastructure. And we're starting to see that matching up with the private investments that you mentioned early on, Mitch, where the automakers and others are making huge billion-dollar investments that are going to really move this to the point where, as you said, it's no longer a question of if we go electric, it's just a question of when. The great thing is, it's a better technology. And so not only is it something where it's going to solve oil dependency, climate issues, reduce emissions, but it's actually faster, works better. And I'm excited to see the technology has finally caught up with the ambition. So thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. That was terrific. You obviously touched on the legislative accomplishments and on what's going on from a regulatory and executive standpoint. So let's turn to Joe and Leilani and ask how your members are taking advantage of these policies and moving investment back to the U.S. to build out these supply chains. Love to hear what you have to say.
Well, Mitch, thanks for having us. I'll maybe start off with a couple investments, and I'll turn it over to Leilani. But just in the last month, we've seen 2 major investments from our battery manufacturers. So Panasonic announced a $4 billion investment in Kansas. It'll be 1,000 jobs. There's a $3.2 billion investment that LG announced in Tennessee, be about 1,000 jobs there. And really, Governor Bill Lee in Tennessee has hit a lot of doubles, maybe a couple triples. They've done a really great job competing for this business. And so I think there's a huge incentive, not only to do work in the U.S. from a regulatory standpoint, but you see the industrial policy that was put in place from the Inflation Reduction Act. There's that $35 per kilowatt hour production tax credit, and then a $10 per kilowatt hour production tax credit for the module. And then there's a 10% investment tax credit in ITC for the minerals. And so we're really, putting some acceleration behind the work that's going to be done here in the U.S. Our members are responding, taking it seriously. And I think that's going to be part of our success story going forward. Obviously, passing a bill is a major achievement, but going out and seeing it put to use and telling the story about how not just the vehicles themselves are superior, as Ben mentioned, but everybody is better off, even those that never get behind the wheel of an EV, from the emissions reduction to the manufacturing to the job growth. This is going to be a real success story, and the sector's ascendant because people want to be a part of it. And I think that's, both Republicans and Democrats from a political standpoint, but people are competing. There's a race out there, not only to win the clean transportation race globally, but, governors are taking this seriously. They want to make sure that these investments are happening in their state. And I think there's no better way to endear yourself to new members of Congress than to, land $1 billion investment or 1,000 extra jobs that they can go back home and say, we're making a real difference in these communities. And so we're excited about it, and we see a lot of potential and opportunities in the year ahead.
Leilani?
Yeah, I'll hop in there. When I think about the bipartisan law, I think of a foundation for the transportation electrification segment, right? We are laying down an opportunity to scale up these investments from critical mineral infrastructure to charging to OEM for automakers to actually build the cars themselves in North America. So looking at those federal grants that maybe are saying, hey, you have a smaller scale shop right now, providing those federal dollars to those companies to either work with a joint venture to create a closed loop system. You have, your critical mineral processing, battery production to the OEMs, then to energy storage, and then back to battery recycling. These critical minerals can be processed in the United States and stay in the United States throughout the entire supply chain. So the bipartisan law actually accelerates those efforts through R&D research, pairing that with national labs. Recently, the administration released $2.8 billion for critical mineral development. Some of our ZETA members also received those funds to scale up operations. Piedmont Lithium is creating over 100 jobs in Tennessee. Albemarle, a critical mineral producer, is also creating 200 jobs in North Carolina. So there's equal parts consumer developments here and engagement with the market and private investment working with public dollars to improve the EV supply chain.
That's awesome. Thank you. Why don't we look at 23 and beyond? And Ben and Joe, we talked about the destiny is clear. It's going to be electrified, but the timeline, it is ambiguous. What's your best guess about how long the transition is going to take?
Go for it, Joe.
Well, so we saw a doubling from last year to this year. If we doubled every year, we'd be at 100% EV sales by the year 2026, 2027. Obviously, that'll be tough to maintain. But I think ultimately what we're going to see is the vehicles, and we mentioned this, obviously in the early years, you had the Nissan Leaf and other vehicles that may not meet every family's needs, but the dozens and dozens of new market segments that are going to be met, I think is going to be one of the bigger accelerants in addition to that federal policy. So, you see the Rivian R1S SUV, you see, new vehicles that, meet kind of the consumer expectation for going to work and church and soccer practice and the things that a family might want. I think that is going to be, kind of the accelerant that is going to drive this in some ways that, the federal policy lays the groundwork for. And so our goal is obviously 100% EV sales by the year 2030. But, we need to meet consumers where they're at. And I think, range, charging infrastructure, all of the things that, the companies themselves are racing ahead to meet the market, but those federal investments can pave the way for. I think that's, really going to determine where we're at in the year 2030, where we're at in 2035. But, I think we're seeing excitement and interest in ways that, exceeded my expectations a year ago or 2 years ago. And so I think, the sky's the limit.
So I'll just add a couple quick things. I think, I think it's like many moments of innovation where it's really hard to predict where that curve starts to jump, but it's already jumping faster. And you can look at some of the indicators, right? So there's a point at which we projected the cost of batteries and the idea that it was 1,000 per kilowatt hour, and then it was going to take 10 years to adjust that curve. But we're already getting to the point where we're almost seeing cost parity with internal combustion engine vehicles. And so that's going to be a big point, right? When consumers can go out and the decision they make at the moment of buying becomes much more equal. it's going to be an obvious choice, right? And I think part of it is also people understanding the socialized benefits of transportation electrification. Every night I plug in at home, the car's full, and so that makes a big difference. And I think that those are things where until people recognize how awesome it is to skip the gas station every day, that's it. You know, that's going to be an exciting moment. It's going to have, you know, real impacts and challenges, and I don't want to, you know, sort of diminish the idea that this is going to be suddenly easy. But I think we're in this really big moment of the curve making another big jump. I also, to Joe's point on the you know, sectors, the idea of medium duty and heavy duty vehicles and buses. I just think that this is going to be one of those places we're going to see huge potential, and that's going to move much faster because the battery costs are going down, because you know, we're starting to see manufacturing at scale, and that's another part. Is so far manufacturing, you know, has been a smaller part of the market because it's been a smaller part of what, you know, sort of the purchasing power was, but that's changing, and we're seeing it. You know, we're seeing it change globally. We're seeing it change where we have even, you know, states that have made huge commitments and in some cases requirements, you know, and we're seeing, as mentioned earlier, this idea that governors are making, you know, being incredibly competitive to get companies to build in their states. And, you know, I was in North Carolina, or I live in North Carolina rather, and I was with the governor yesterday, and he talked about the idea of Toyota building a battery manufacturing plant in North Carolina. The idea that we are seeing VinFast, who's building a huge manufacturing facility in North Carolina. And so I think it's really also going to be exciting because people are going to be building these vehicles. Federal employees are going to be driving these. State agencies are going to be driving these. And so I think we're going to start to see that curve happen much faster. And I like the idea of that 2030 marker. I think we have a lot of work to do when we get onto, you know, much more rural communities, and there's a lot of work around education so that we can break the political divide. This needs to be not a red and blue issue, but a red, white, and blue issue. And I think we have a great opportunity to start to build that.
Yeah, that's great. You know, when I was at the Alliance 2011 to the end of 2018, I tracked every month people's interest in what kind of powertrain they wanted. And for the first 5 years, it didn't tick at all. It was you know, they used hybrids as a proxy for an alternative powertrain, and you had some interest. Electrification itself there's just nothing there until the Tesla 3 came along, and then you began to see literally a pop, and it was minor, but that popping now is going on big time, and it really is remarkable. So I'm going to drill down a bit more on this question. And Joe, I know the aspiration is 2030. And aspiration is wonderful, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what would you say would be success by 2035 in terms of share of new car sales?
Well, so if you look at the Energy Innovation Report, you know, they were calculating, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act and where we would be. They thought the incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act would get us to about 65–70% EV sales by the year 2030. But I think what is hard to estimate, and Ben touched on this, is, you know, where's the battery chemistry? What are the costs? You know, how much progress can we make on the charging infrastructure? You know, to me, what we know is that if you get somebody behind the wheel of an EV, they're 95% likely to never go back. And so to me, the importance is exposing drivers to electrification. And there's a couple of ways we can do this. Obviously, if it's at work and it's a fleet vehicle, or you're looking at rentals or leases, it's kind of a lower barrier to entry. And so I think those are ways where we can really accelerate exposure and then deployment and uptake. But the other one, which is kind of a missed part of the Inflation Reduction Act, is that used EV credit, the $4,000 you can get to purchase a used EV. That's one of the limitations of the legacy credit, is that it was only targeted for new vehicles, which is only about 30% of the market. 70% of car sales are used car sales. And so I think this is going to be one of the sleeper issues that's really going to catapult deployment forward.
Excellent. Ben, anything to add there?
I would just say, sorry, I had to hit the mute button very quickly. You know, when your kid's getting off a bus and the bus is silent and it doesn't have diesel fumes coming off it, I think that's going to rapidly expose, in a good way, the benefits of electrification. When governments can start to recognize the CapEx and OpEx, and what I mean by that is capital expenditure. So you have to buy a vehicle. We oftentimes don't think about what does it cost to operate those vehicles every day, right? How much, what are we spending on gas, maintenance, et cetera? And I think that we're going to very quickly start to see more and more of these stories come out where governments shift and they start to see the huge cost savings associated with it. The uptime is better, right? The vehicles are on the road more often. They save tons of money because of the amount of time people have to spend refueling, right? Because in general, you park and the car charges or the vehicle charges, and then it's ready to go. And we haven't even started to get into issues like vehicle to grid solutions, where there's going to be huge monetization potential. I also think this is the same thing that happened. Like, my kids don't even know what a VCR is, right? The only way they know how to watch something is streaming. But for a long time, people have said that's ridiculous. No way would we stream everything. Same thing with music, right? There's no such thing as a CD anymore, roughly. Vinyl still has a little place to play. But I think in general, it's the same kind of thing where, my 5-year-old's never going to go to a gas station, and it's going to be this sort of legacy conversation. And I think it's going to be, it's going to be the same thing. That technology becomes outdated, and we're going to have a point at which that happens, and it's just going to become obsolete. And there's, people will be like, how could we have possibly driven an internal combustion engine, right? But it was what made sense when we had it. So I think we're going to see some of these big changes.
Yeah, that's great. You brought back memories for me. Before I went to the Alliance, I was with the recording industry from 03 to 11. And when I got there, it was all about plastic, and it was all about physical sales. And years later, obviously this was years later, physical sales just started plummeting. And now when you hold up a CD, it looks like an antique. And it's just really a remarkable thing. They don't even come in cars anymore. And so you're right, there is a psychological adaptation that takes place, and we're in the middle of it. So it's an extraordinarily dynamic moment. Let me bring Leilani back in. You mentioned the minerals refining, processing, recycling facilities. And can you talk a bit more about the auto jobs that are being generated and how that influences Congress?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mitch. I think transportation electrification has an opportunity to make us a global leader in this sector again. Job creation has been, as we mentioned throughout the webinar today, job creation is happening in red, blue, purple states, particularly in southern states with advanced manufacturing. And these investments are happening through private investments, of course, and using those funding structures from the bipartisan infrastructure law. If we look at how what our OEMs are doing today, as Ben mentioned, the Tesla electric semi-truck is a really exciting announcement as we look into the medium and heavy duty sector. Canoo just opened a manufacturing facility in Oklahoma. One of our member companies, Arrival, is actually bringing their production facility to South Carolina because they recognize, after the passage of the IRA, the United States is going to be a huge driver in the global auto market. So things are happening in real time. There's a real shift happening throughout the light duty vehicle segment, as well as medium and heavy duty. Looking at taking it even a step back further, and we look at off-takers, Walmart, FedEx, DHL, how they're going to be pairing their fleet operations with electrified medium heavy duty vehicles with last mile delivery. Maybe even take an example of the United States Postal Service for their fleet operations, and how that's going to serve not only business entities, but the consumer. These are going to be driving, these investments and ventures are going to be driving, they're going to have reduced cost operations from the reduced fuel and maintenance for the fleet managers. So not only is the automotive market shifting for your school bus, the kids on the school bus, the mom picking up their kids from soccer practice, but also for real business entities that we see and visit every day.
That is perfect. Thank you very much. Ben, I want to go back to you in terms of the Electrification Coalition. Can you amplify about how you can drive a sense of urgency in Congress? We can see the dynamic marketplace, the investment, but how do we sell it? How do we catapult this?
Yeah, I think we've touched on it some, but the U.S. has long been a leader in the automotive industry. We have a huge number of jobs that are in auto manufacturing. You know, we build the software that goes into every vehicle, and we've been leaders on that side of the fence too. And I think sometimes we sort of forget about that space. But we sort of dominated it from a global perspective and been a leader. And so I think that needs to be, it's one of the reasons that there were opportunities to pass the Inflation Reduction Act and to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law is we need to compete globally. And this is an economic and national security issue. And we have to ensure that we create the policies that are going to allow us to have the supply chain we need to meet the future of transportation. We can't hand it over to countries like China, who have already moved much faster than us. And we have to make sure that we're positioning ourselves in a way that we maintain that global leadership, that market leadership, because it's where it's headed. And so we don't want to be left as laggards. Let's lead. And I think that's a message that can really resonate with members of Congress on all sides of the aisle. And I think it's also something and I know we're going to get into it later, the state dynamics and the local dynamics, but I think it's something that really can work effectively. I also think oil dependency and this idea that, we import 40% of the oil we use every day. We can't drill our way out of the solution, is something that also can really resonate with folks that, this is a place where we can actually build good jobs in the US that are going to be sustainable, meaning they'll be here for the long term. And so that's the other reason these policies really matter and why Congress needs to, get together on these issues and support a bipartisan agenda on transportation electrification.
Great. This question of cost equivalency is huge, and that will obviously have a massive impact on the timing of the transition. There was a question from the audience about battery costs. Do any of you want to kind of tackle that question and offer some perspective on how that's changing?
Well, Mitch, I'll maybe jump in there. So as many of us that follow the policy arena know, about $100 a kilowatt hour is what we've kind of pegged as price parity between EVs and internal combustion engine vehicles. Prior to, I think, some of the inflation we've seen in the last 18 months, there was a trajectory down to, $65, $62 per kilowatt hour. And so at that price, you'd be far exceeding price parity. And Ben mentioned this already, consumers would show up and be able to not only, receive a superior product with better torque and performance, fuel maintenance and service savings, but upfront price savings. I think, the blockage of the Suez Canal and and COVID challenges in the Ukraine war, there's been a lot of, I think, obstructions towards that arc down to, $60 some per kilowatt hour, but we're going to get there. I think obviously sooner is better, but, that's the trajectory we're on. And then, you look at, the solid state battery and some of the technology where you get higher energy density and lower pricing and faster charging times. That'll be the real game changer. It's kind of like fusion energy in that it's been, around the corner for way too long. We want it to come tomorrow. But I think once you get into solid state batteries, I know Nissan made an announcement this morning even about their work on a solid state battery they want to bring to market. So we're coming down. I think, all vehicles are expensive. All new vehicles are expensive. And, I think this sector is not been immune from some of the price challenges that everybody's faced over the last year and a half, but we're getting there.
Great.
Maybe just a quick note, BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, has a great chart, so it looks at the idea of like the cost back in 2013 and how quickly it's come down to today. And it's hard for, I think a lot of people would go like, what's a kilowatt hour and why does that matter for a battery? And, it's like, not everybody's an EV nerd like we are. But I think what it means is you're going to get, more, you can travel longer distances because of the battery on the vehicle, and it's going to cost less. And so at the end of the day, those are going to translate into costing less for consumers when they buy the vehicle. And that's what matters, right? Battery right now is one of the most expensive parts of an EV, but they've come down way faster than anyone was predicting. And, BNEF did a predictive model, and they didn't think we'd be at this place already. And I think that's really a testament to the innovation and investments that are being made globally and in the US that we're able to drive down those costs so fast, and we're going to see them go down even quicker.
That is awesome. I'm going to explore one more item with both of you, kind of your fear and your hope. What keeps you up at night worrying about this transition? And then if you had, that's the fear part. And then the hope part is if you had a magic wand, I'm gonna be king for a moment and grant you each a magic wand, what would you do with that magic wand to accelerate this transition? Fear and hope.
I'll go for it first, since Joe, you took the bullet for the target for when we're going to hit penetration, so to speak. So fear. I think the fear is that this gets caught up as a political issue, and that it turns into this partisan sort of rhetoric thing, and it's a mistake. It's really something where this is an issue, and I think sometimes it's because it's been driven as a climate solution. It is a climate solution. It's going to solve GHG emissions. But sometimes that then creates the wrong debate. The debate here is, this is better technology. It's where we're headed. And but I just get concerned that we're going to fight it, that continue to fight around that issue and turn it into a political juggling back and forth, and pushing the football back and forth. And that's unfortunate. Hopefully we can get the talking points right for everybody, so that we can align on this and recognize why EVs make sense for everyone. The magic wand moment, that one feels way harder to me. I think in general, I think if fleets transition and they continue to they lead, I think it's we underestimate the value of that, right? Those are vehicle demonstrations at scale, right? Every day they're traveling on city streets, they're traveling on our highways, they're branded, right? Those fleet vehicles show up, and it really normalizes EVs in a way that people go, oh, everybody drives an EV. I should own an EV. I should check this out next time I go buy a car. And I think that's already starting to happen. But also, every fleet driver is a consumer. And so, right, they're feeling that experience day in and day out. And, everyone will show, and I'm sure Joe and Leonard will talk about this, but it's every person who drives an EV becomes a big advocate, because they really are that much better than internal combustion engine. So that's the thing. I think fleets, if we could get them to move faster, it'll shift the market even faster. So that's my magic wand moment.
Excellent.
Well, Mitch, I'll do hope and fear, and I'll let Leilani have the magic wand. My, I guess, fear is, humans are adaptable, but we also can be intolerant of change. And so I think my fear is that, we've reached a penetration in the marketplace for people that are most curious. They're probably most invested in electrification, as we each 10%, 20% additional penetration for new EV sales we get are going to be to folks that this is extraordinarily new to, and charging is just different. It's not wait until you get to empty and then go into the gas station, refueling, and on your way in 2 or 3 minutes. It really is charging while you're doing other things. My hope is that people will see it in the background, that charging happens while you're doing other things. It's convenient. It's symmetrical with other parts of your daily routine. And so I guess fear being that, there's, we reach some impediments where, consumers see the challenges more so than they see the upsides, or that they emphasize or over focus on some of the differences and not necessarily the benefits. So on the hope side, again, it's that folks are able to seamlessly charge in a way that aligns with their life, and that they then realize that not only do I wake up every morning with a full charge or have easy access to charging at work or at the grocery store, but they realize, and this is something that we had done a study on, we went and compared the AAA gas prices to the Energy Information Administration electricity pricing, and it's 5 or 6 times more expensive to drive your vehicle with gasoline rather than electricity. And so my hope is that the economics drive this, not only for the battery pack and the pricing going on a downward trend, but achieving the fuel maintenance and service savings in addition to that upfront cost, so that this is a no-brainer for folks. And I think that's what we realize in American politics, is that the economics drive nearly everything. I don't think we're going to get to 100% EV sales off of ESG considerations or emissions reduction, although those are very important. It's going to have to be the economics. And so my hope is that the economics, we come down the cost curve and really drive deployment in a way that helps people from a pocketbook standpoint.
Great. And I'll put our magic wand out here. The good news, I think, is that the magic wand actually has already happened. The Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan law together are the magic wand that we were waiting for to jump off the electrification transition. My hope is that states and localities have the right information and resources. You have a bunch of billions of dollars coming down through these grants and funding opportunities and how to electrify, making sure that we are the connective tissue between DOT and state DOTs and making sure that education is out there. My fear is that education isn't rolled out, and that we can't use these funds, but the magic wand is here. It is this moment. So we're very excited to see what happens next, and making sure that each segment throughout the entire EV supply chain is supported from small to large business entities.
That's great. I like the fact that magic is reality now. So that's kind of that doesn't happen often. So that's kind of cool. What I'd like to do, I think, is exercise a minute of moderator discretion and make a point, and then maybe hand it back over to Catherine for the next panel. And I guess my observation is that our context has changed dramatically in 2 years. No, or 3 years. We've gone from a debate that was political, that was philosophical, that was ideological, conceptual, and aspirational, to a kind of here and now with billions of dollars on the table from the private side, from the public side, with a vastly different circumstance when it comes to consumer interest and range, and investment in charging, and our fundamental understanding of the geopolitical context is so different than it was 3 years ago. Pre-Ukraine, pre-COVID, our globalism is not popular these days, but global dependency is really well understood these days. And for us to be a vibrant nation that is both clean and safe and prosperous, we've got to succeed here. And so I hope the magic wand is here, and that all the market conditions evolve in a way that we expect it will, and it happens very, very quickly. So Catherine, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Joe and Ben and Leilani. That was fantastic. And we're going to move now and talk about the state, city, and the local levels, and what we're seeing now post-midterm elections, and what the outlook is for 2023. So I'd like to introduce now Carl Pope, who's the former CEO of the Sierra Club and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Climate of Hope. And he's going to bring up our state and local panel. Oh, and Carl, you just have to unmute. There you go.
I didn't actually have control of that. Somebody else unmuted me. That panel will include you, Catherine, so I'm not going to introduce you, but two of your colleagues from the Electrification Coalition, Katie Robinson, the Vice President of Programs and Operations, and Aaron Villas, if that is how it's pronounced, Aaron, I apologize, I don't know for sure. Also, he's the Director of Campaigns. And before I turn it over to them, I want to raise a risk profile issue. We are talking about electrification of cars as a thing in isolation, and we are talking about the federal programs that were passed, including the investment, the IRA, from the supply side, and that's all very important. But we saw during the pandemic that a life-saving technology can become a political issue in the United States. And if IRA broadly, if the whole idea of clean electrification, if wind and solar continue to be intensely politicized, there is, I think, a significant risk of spillover into the automotive sector, even though it's not logically or in an engineering sense connected. I understand. And the other thing that's interesting about IRA and that the media are just missing is this is not a conventional federal program. It is not something of which Washington controls the scale or Washington can implement. This is a consumer opportunity. It is actually an unlimited consumer opportunity. And that is fundamentally going to be driven by how people feel about buying a car. It isn't just going to be driven by the price of batteries. We didn't move to SUVs because some engineering miracle made them more appropriate. We moved to SUVs because Americans decided, with a little bit of help from the auto manufacturers, that they were a better thing to drive. We need to take seriously the responsibility to make Americans understand why electric cars are something better to drive. And I think there is a risk in the media, particularly, that that message will get lost. And I don't think we should just leave it up to proprietary OEMs. And in particular, Tesla has been carrying a lot of the load. And I think letting Tesla continue to carry the load is a very high risk activity given other things that are happening in the media. So I really think we need to think seriously about how do we get the average American in the state of Texas excited about buying an electric car when they buy their next car. I think that should be our challenge, to build a barrier against this kind of resistance. And I picked Texas because it's a state with genuine opportunities, both on the vehicle side, but also on the clean energy side, and also a very substantial historic investment, obviously, in oil and gas. So I picked Texas, and we need to keep at the top of our minds, how do we keep the average Texan excited about buying an electric vehicle, or how do we get the average Texan excited about buying a vehicle? And with that, I'm going to turn over to Catherine and Aaron. And would you like, and Catherine, why don't you begin? What's happening on the political front at the state and local level?
There was a lot of changes that happened in the midterm elections, and I think the focus is moving into implementation here with all of the great federal funding. As Leilani was saying, we've got the magic wand is here. This is our EV moment, and so we're excited for with new governors coming in some of the states, different control of some of the state houses, what that means, what that new opportunity means. And so, as a lot of our panelists have said today, this is EVs are a bipartisan issue. And so I think the changes that we're seeing from the midterms, this opens up a lot of new opportunities and new ideas, new innovation coming in. It's we've seen momentum from some of the states on the regulatory side with maybe it's the Advanced Clean Car Program, it's the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, it's the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule. So we'll see some states for sure continue to move forward with that regulatory activity, and maybe some states pivot and decide to do something different with how they're moving forward with electrification. But as Leilani was saying in the earlier panel, with the job opportunities now that we're seeing going into the southern states, and Aaron's going to talk about the Midwest. I think a lot of state players their policymakers are realizing this is a huge opportunity for us and a way for the United States to get back on the map with a lot of economic opportunities here, economic development opportunities. So that was quick, but I'm going to turn it to maybe Aaron, and you want to elaborate on that.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. It's Aaron Viles, just to be clear. But I think you nailed it, Carl. That idea that we want people in Texas to be excited to buy an EV. As much as we want people in, say, Massachusetts to be excited to buy an EV. And obviously, as the landscape has shifted, and you don't have to buy a Buck Rogers looking EV, and you can buy a truck that looks like it clearly is going to meet your needs. There's a lot more enthusiasm about the models that are coming our way, but we do need to be super mindful of the politics associated with EVs. And I'm sure as we're coming back from our Thanksgiving breaks, folks probably had some eye-opening conversations with their uncle or whomever about some misinformation that's out there, and that's real. It's being planted, it's being pushed. We need to get ahead of it, and we need to be able to answer with facts as much as possible. But at the federal level, that's happening. At the state house level, even more so to some degree. So I think there's that kind of, what are we going to see from the state? Are we going to see them just seeking to get the jobs, or are they also going to be seeking to push some complementary policy to ensure that they're the leader in EV deployment? And I think that's gonna vary a bit region by region. But we as Catherine mentioned, we saw some significant changes, which I think opens up lots of opportunities in the kind of re-industrialized areas of the country that were looking to see, this EV transition really breathing new life into manufacturing realities. I think Pennsylvania is very exciting because, a great new governor coming in, flipping the state house for the first time in a while. We're going to see some opportunities to move forward there. I think also, as you mentioned, the Midwest, Michigan, Governor Whitmer was reelected. She's made the shift to EVs really a priority of her administration, but she was primarily forced to do that through kind of thought leadership and industry collaborations. She's got a great climate plan and a future of mobility and electrification plan, but any significant funding or policy efforts have been stymied by the legislature. Now we've got a kind of a trifecta there, first time since 1984. And I think we're going to see the funding and policy momentum really pick up in Michigan, which of course, Michigan is just a leader in mobility, and I think that can be very influential through the Midwest. Hopefully Illinois is similarly kind of continuing to move forward. Minnesota is interesting because they did flip a chamber, so they got a trifecta there for the first time in a decade. Minnesota is the only state which embraced any regulatory efforts to advance clean cars. So now I think better positioned to further regional leadership in the regulatory front. Some areas that we've seen leadership, and now we're kind of interested to see if there's going to be changes. In Nevada, Governor Sisolak lost. He had been, I think, really embraced some opportunities on the regulatory front. The newly elected governor, Joe Lombardo, hasn't said much on electrification, but as we have heard about earlier, the kind of Tesla semi delivery event that's happening in Sparks, Nevada. So that's a great way to underscore that economic activity. So what we've known, kind of looking at the state level, all these lawmakers will show up at the ribbon cuttings for the battery factories or the EV factories, but will they embrace some policies, and will they speak out kind of against some of the pushback that we are seeing, because there are efforts to make this a partisan issue. And as we know, it's a U.S. advancement issue. It's a best for our national security, best for our kind of global efforts to combat climate change. And I think it'll be interesting to watch at the state level. We'll be engaged in a lot of states, but we do know that it's going to be a kind of state-by-state conversation. And the Southeast, similarly, like lots of investment, will we see complementary policy embraced? But with Leilani's magic wand in place, we know at a minimum we're going to need to see states leaning forward to maximize the federal funding opportunities, to match that up with robust transportation electrification plans and programs. So NEVI's a kind of like no-brainer. They should do that well, but there's lots of other buckets of funding that are available if there's some kind of visionary leadership to electrify large parts of the like freight or fleets or other opportunities to get a lot of bang for our buck with those federal investments.
Because you were at Indianapolis and you've been there now. Give us what should the game plan for the state of Indiana, which is right next to Michigan and Illinois, what should the game plan for the great state of Indiana look like? Because if we can turn Indiana, that would actually be very significant. And Indiana did have a significant investment on the battery side. So it's not a state that's been completely resistant, but it's a state where the politics are probably pretty complicated. Tell us about that.
No, I appreciate that, Carl. Aaron reminds me constantly, as my colleague in the Midwest, that we are not a unicorn, but I would still like to say that we're a special unicorn. But Governor Holcomb has been very supportive of so many of the economic development announcements that we have seen on the battery manufacturing side just in the last couple of months. He did attend COP this year as well, and was talking very much about his clean energy plan. The good news is that Commissioner Smith, NDOT Commissioner Smith, was very engaging with the city of Indianapolis as it related to the NEVI plan. I think we're going to continue to see that solid partnership between the state and obviously the capital city. That leads to great collaboration and innovation. And I only see some positive outcomes out of that. But Indianapolis has long been in the EV game. We were one of the first cities to have we were the first city to have a car share program. It was Blue Indy. While that has since moved on, we have replaced it with a subscription service. But we also had some pretty ambitious goals around transitioning our entire city fleet. So we were going to go up to 425 vehicles at one point. That has sort of backed off as there has been some availability issues. But you know, we continue to see cities as a hotbed for innovation, and it's really exciting.
Are there any particular things that you think worked well? Why did Indianapolis is a unicorn. That's a fair comment. And were there any things that the cities did earlier, that somebody else did earlier, that set Indiana up that way?
So I would say, you know, Indianapolis is actually, and Indiana in general, is a really interesting test case, politically speaking. We are known to split our tickets in the state of Indiana. And Indianapolis in particular has had a pretty successful line of mayors over the last 30, 40 years. Mayor Ballard came in, and he was actually the one that set us up for success when it came to the transition of electric vehicles, beginning in 2011 with Vision Fleet, as I mentioned, with transitioning the fleet of vehicles, and also saw the writing on the wall as it came to Blue Indy and providing a car share service. And Mayor Hogsett has continued that transition very successfully. They are currently looking at an EV readiness ordinance. It is really exciting. We are part of the American Cities Climate Challenge, and half of our goals related to transportation and electrifying our mass transit system, in addition to getting the consumers in Indianapolis up to speed about what's available to them.
I want to throw in one point that we haven't touched on, and that is actually the cost advantage, which we all count on, may not be there for the next 3 years. The price of electricity is going to go up in a whole lot of places because there are very, very large capital costs that are being poured out, gradually Texas being a spectacular example. Utility bills in the Northeast are going to skyrocket, and that's been one of the places where you would expect EVs to take off. So one of the things that we need to keep tracking is what will keep the price of power down is if the solar and wind side of IRA makes progress as well as the auto side. So we are all linked together. And I think there is a tendency in these things for everybody to go off into their little silo. I just want to encourage all of us to think we're part of a larger revolution. It's not just an electrification revolution, it's also a clean electricity revolution. And I think that we need to pay close attention to how we manage that crossover in a way that doesn't create a partisan split. And I think the comment that I can't remember, I think Catherine may have said, it wasn't Catherine, but making this too much of a climate issue, although I'm a climate person, would be a mistake. And we need to be, one of the things that I think is one of the very best stories that I've heard about why you should want to buy an electric car is some of the comments about the non-driving functions of the Ford Lightning. The fact that actually the Ford Lightning is a whole workshop. It's not just a car or a truck. And that's a tremendous opportunity and not something you would expect to come from a granola crunchy San Franciscan like me. With that note, I'm going to turn it back to Catherine. You've all been very gracious with your time, and this has been, I think, an amazing panel from both the federal and the state perspective. Over to you, Catherine.
Great, thank you, Carl. And yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, Ben mentioned vehicle to grid, and when we talk about post-elections, we always think what happened in Congress, what happened at the state level, the local level, but utility commissions, a lot of those are elected officials too. And so what can we see now in 2023 with some new commissioner seats coming on? And that ties in perfectly to your point there about electricity and adoption and integration of renewables. And so, what does that mean? How fast can that happen? What's the activity that we're going to see at the commissioner level? So stay tuned, maybe everybody, for a part 2 of this where we can dive deeper into that kind of an issue there. But I'd just like to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you so much, Carl and ZETA and Mitch, for participating today. And we look forward to catching up with everyone on our next webinar. Take care, everyone. Thanks.